roundtables on the environment and sustainable prosperity, which is a voluntary committee legislated to conduct a review of the Act every 5 years. I want to thank the roundtable and their members for their hard work and their thoughtful recommendations to the government. Mr. Speaker, we have much to be proud of. It is our achievements of EGSPA so far. 14 out of the 21 goals have been met, and we work to continue on meeting the remaining targets that have deadlines between 2015 and 2020. During the Roundtable's consultation, Nova Scotians clearly told us that they want their environment protected for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, they want to know that the growing our economy doesn't come at the expense of our environment. We also heard from some municipalities, Mr. Speaker, that told us that they are having a difficult time upgrading their equipment to meet the water and wastewater targets. I am pleased to report that 86% of the municipalities are meeting the drinking water standards. And Mr. Speaker, 91% of the municipalities in our province are treating their wastewater. We also recognize that remaining municipalities need more time to make the changes needed to meet the standards. That is why we have moved the target date for drinking water standards and wastewater treatment to 2020. And we continue to lobby the federal government to provide funding to municipalities so that they can invest in the infrastructure needed to meet the standards. Mr. Speaker, one of the key recommendations by the Roundtable is to make the connection between the environment and the economy even stronger in the Act. Mr. Speaker, that is why we have added 2 new goals to EGSPA. The first goal is to develop a renewable energy framework that will help the province move towards reducing the dependency on fossil fuels for electricity. The second goal is to develop a strategy by 2014 to advance the growth of the green economy. Mr. Speaker, this government has made considerable investments in our green economy, and we are seeing results. Companies like Daewoo, Carbon Sense Solutions, and LED roadway lighting are creating good jobs for Nova Scotians while providing technology that helps our environment. Mr. Speaker, by developing a green economy strategy, we can build on our successes and create even more jobs for Nova Scotians. And as Marty Janowitz, the chair of the Roundtable, has said, the province has done a good job meeting the Pacific environmental goals, but now the Act will now truly be part of our environment and our economy. If Nova Scotia wants to move forward, we need to change how we view the future so that the path forward isn't just about prosperity, it's about sustainable prosperity. And this legislation will help us get there. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your time.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act of 2007 is actually a very important piece of legislation, one of the most important pieces of legislation that's been brought before this House in the last 20 years. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, it received all party support at that time when it was passed into law. Mr. Speaker, this same act has been studied and admired and copied and duplicated in other provincial legislatures and other state houses in the United States, and indeed in countries and in subnational governments around the world. And I know that certainly those of us in the Progressive Conservative Caucus are proud of that piece of legislation. I believe many, many, many Nova Scotians are proud of that particular piece of legislation, and the bill that the minister is bringing today actually seeks to amend it. Mr. Speaker, what the bill today does not do is strengthen it. In fact, it weakens it. And that is the sad fact of the bill that is before the House today, Mr. Speaker. The Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act was very clear that it would set real, meaningful targets, both on the environmental side, around renewable energy, around clean water, around wastewater disposal, around emissions into our atmosphere, and so on. And it also sets some clear economy goals. Specifically, that Nova Scotia would strive to grow its economy at the rate of the national average or better each year. Mr. Speaker, once again, we have an NDP minister rising in this House, changing the environmental goals, but silent on the economy goals. And the problem with that, Mr. Speaker, is that one half of this great equation, how we match our growing economy to a clean environment, has been lost under the NDP, and that, of course, is the economy side. Because the NDP have failed, even once. They failed every year, not just once, to have a growing economy in Nova Scotia at the national average. In fact, the most recent reports from Statistics Canada show Nova Scotia is near the bottom. In fact, for 2011 was at the bottom in economic growth, nowhere near the national average. The government has an opportunity now that we're reviewing the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act to actually have something positive to say about how we're going to grow the economy and create jobs in the future, how they're going to address this dismal record of full-time job losses and poor economic results under their time in office. But yet, once again today, they have nothing to say about that because the record is so poor. Mr. Speaker, a review of the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, as is required by law this year at year 5 of that Act's existence, should properly review both the performance on meeting our economic goals, which it doesn't, which is poor, and how we're doing in meeting our environmental goals. And even on that side of the equation, Mr. Speaker, the record is not very good. The minister points out, for example, he's adding 2 new goals to the environmental goals. And I say to you, sir, that these are no goals at all. That even in the minister's own preamble to his bill, it says that when we add goals to this important piece of legislation, they ought to be clear and measurable and attainable. And yet, his first new goal is to develop a strategy on a green economy, meaning we'll have some goals in the future. Well, once and for all, Mr. Speaker, I wish this government would understand that having a goal to set a goal is not in itself a goal. Having a goal to have a strategy at a future date is meaningless. And on such an important piece of legislation, on one that received all party support, on one that's been copied around the world, to weaken it, which such a sad addition to the list of goals, is to do a disservice to all of those Nova Scotians on all sides of this House and around the province who believed in this great agreement that was reached 5 years ago to make sure that we had environmental goals and economic goals that work together, Mr. Speaker, but that's not what's happening here. The minister is relaxing the goals around wastewater management in order to give our municipalities further time to figure out how to finance the infrastructure upgrades needed to meet these goals. Well, Mr. Speaker, what assurance do we have that at the end of this additional time that the minister is giving, that those municipalities will be any further ahead in figuring out how to meet the higher costs of these new standards that have been set? And you know what, Mr. Speaker, that's not to say that they shouldn't, because after all, higher water standards are important. And they were part of that great consensus that was reached 5 years ago. But what we have is an NDP government that has made the financing of these projects by our municipalities harder and harder during their term in office. By downloading more cost onto municipalities when they ripped up the Memorandum of Understanding with those municipalities, they made it harder to meet these standards. By not working with other levels of government, federal government and municipal government, on programs to help pay for them, they've made it harder and harder to meet these standards. So the NDP answer today, which is a pretty weak one, is to say, well, we'll just push the deadline further into the future. We'll just give you more time, but won't actually give you, as a municipality, more means to meet those standards. Well, that's no plan at all, Mr. Speaker. And it further weakens a great piece of legislation like the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. And Mr. Speaker, I just can't help but point out that the reason that the minister gives for providing more time to municipalities on this target is that they can't afford the price increases, that it places too great a financial burden on our municipalities, that they deserve a break. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly the argument that we have been making to the NDP on behalf of all Nova Scotians about their electricity bills. That the NDP took this great compromise, this great balance of 2007 on renewables within a growing economy, and they jacked up the renewable targets from 25% to 40% without rebalancing the economy targets, accepting the crushing effect it would have on our economy and on jobs for their own means, creating an unfair hardship on the backs of Nova Scotia ratepayers, both families who struggle to make the family budget work every month when they get their electric bill, and Nova Scotia employers. Time after time, Nova Scotia employers have come forward to say, one of the reasons we can't grow, one of the reasons we can't compete, one of the reasons that we have to lay off Nova Scotians is because we can't keep up with our power rate increases. That's exactly the effect of jacking up those targets and not looking at the economy side at the same time. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the NDP campaigned on lower power rates. They got into office, and the first thing they did was take steps that jack up our power rates. And as long as Mr. Speaker, as long as the price of power is going up and up because of the NDP electricity plan, all Nova Scotians have a hidden tax of 1% to 2% every month on their power bills. And that 1% to 2% by admission of the Minister of Energy, and it's actually written right into their power plan, is going to continue on for years to come, compounding and compounding every year, a hidden tax on our power bills that no one asked Nova Scotians if they were willing to pay for. And in fact, they've been very clear, Mr. Speaker, that they can't continue along this road of ever higher power rates year after year after year, like we've seen under the NDP. So why is it, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP and the minister speaking to this bill today are perfectly okay with saying we're going to give some relief to our municipalities because they can't afford to keep up with the goal that we assigned to them, but we're going to continue to push Nova Scotians further backwards on their household budgets. We're going to put further strain on Nova Scotia employers. We're going to watch more Nova Scotians have their jobs be put at risk because we have a no-compromise approach to the ever-escalating price of their electricity bill. Mr. Speaker, if the minister had brought forward a proper review of the entire Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act that actually provided some rate relief to Nova Scotians, that actually addressed the glaring inadequacies of the economic goals under the NDP, we might be able to support it. But until that day comes, Mr. Speaker, all I can say about this bill is it falls far short of giving Nova Scotians the relief that they need, and it weakens a great act of this legislature of 5 years ago that no one believed the NDP would do, but they are very disappointed to see happen here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. We now recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few words about this. It's interesting. This obviously, many of the provisions in these amendments actually relax the original EGSPA legislation. And I guess some of them are, in fact, many of the things that relax provisions in that bill are decisions that have already been taken by regulatory or cabinet order, I guess. And so I guess this is just matching the legislation to decisions that have already been made. It would have been nice in many respects to have had this debate, and some of them there may very well have been good reasons for, but it would have been nice to have had this debate before the decisions were made. So, for example, when you look at things such as the wastewater, I mean, the wastewater is an interesting example because the original target for having the primary treatment, for example, my understanding in the Act was 2008. It's now 2012. In 2008, the former Tory government was in place, so they didn't deal with it either, and it was their legislation. Then the NDP got in power, and they didn't deal with it. And so, as I said to somebody the other day, I was asked whether this is something that could impact public safety. Well, I mean, of course, there's always that potential, but at the same token, if a municipality hasn't begun any significant work, there's still only, we're approaching 2013, so there's really only 7 years left to get that in place anyways, and most of those projects often take that long or close to that long anyways. That goal alone is not going to work, Mr. Speaker, unless this government is going to either alone or in partnership with the federal government establish some kind of infrastructure program to assist the municipalities, because the very fact they couldn't afford it before, now the MOU's been changed, they're certainly not going to be able to afford it now because some of the things that they had hoped to have in terms of lower costs in the future now no longer exist. So unless the government actually comes forward with an infrastructure program of some kind, we're going to be here in 2020 having the same debate and pushing it ahead again. And so that's something that needs to be addressed. There is one of the things that has been pointed out many times is that the Environmental Goals and Sustainability Prosperity Act is as much an aspiration of what you want to happen. And I think there's some good goals. I don't have the same concerns that the gentleman that spoke before me has about the two new goals. I think they're fine goals. I'm not sure that they're any different than what the previous Tory government put in place, where those were going to do a strategy. So that is what the oh yeah, my colleague would like to do an introduction, Mr. Speaker, if that would be okay with you.
Thank you very much. The Honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Honourable member for Dartmouth East for giving me a moment. But I'd like to draw to the attention of the House members a former member who spent many years in this House representing the good people of Hants West. Mr. Ron Russell joins us this afternoon for a bit. So welcome, Ron, and give him a hand, guys.
I might add that the honourable member also spent 3 different terms in the chair as Speaker here in this House of Assembly. Thank you. The Honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was just thinking that, and so now we're going to get speakers' rulings from 2 ends of the chamber, I guess, today. So if you read the original Environmental Goals Sustainable Prosperity Act, it was a collection of aspirations, and by this date we'll get this strategy done, by this date we'll get this strategy done. So you had various things such as the wetland strategy and so forth. So these 2 new goals, despite the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party saying that he was disappointed that the green economy one was just a strategy, that's all that was in the previous act too. So it is I agree that you have to have something more than a strategy, and I think that's very important, but that's been the nature of that act since it was first introduced by the former Minister of the Environment. But it does raise the question of what happens and where do you get those strategies done? This amendment is oddly entitled the Green Economy Act, and yet it doesn't actually provide anything related to the green economy other than a promise that some strategy will be done at some point in the future. The you need to have more than that. You need to actually say how that's going to work out. The other issue with this is, you know, we can put all the targets and aspirations we want, but there's no penalties if you don't meet any of the provisions under the Environmental Goals and Sustainability Prosperity Act. When the water strategy was released, I believe it was earlier this year, but within the past year anyways, I think the water strategy was released. Again, there were some very good provisions in it, but it is yet to be backed up by legislation. It is yet to be backed up by anything that has penalties if things are not met. So it's very easy for the government to just not follow it because what can you do? There is no ability under that for a member of the public or an organization to seek remedies through the courts based on that act because there isn't a remedy available in the act. And that was, I wasn't here for the debate in 2007, but I guess that's what all parties agreed to, that this was an aspiration of what wanted to be achieved. And I do believe that at the time, the intent was to try and match the demands of an economy with the demands of the demands of the economy with the demands of the environment. And in many cases, those things are linked, and one only needs to look into the U.S. in the past few weeks with Hurricane Sandy to understand the linkages between the environment and the economy. I can't remember, some astronomical amount of money that they felt the economic impact of Sandy was. And part of that was related to the fact that they keep building things the same way. So there is an article which maybe around by third reading I'll find again and I'll table for the interest of the House that talked about the fact that every time there's one of these storms and the power lines go down and the gas lines get torn up, they go back and they build it exactly the same way. Well, we do the same thing here, Mr. Speaker. We don't go and say, well, you know, we're going to build this differently so that we can address these things in the future. Halifax Regional Municipality has done a lot of work around LIDAR to try and figure out, well, where could you build homes and businesses and so forth with, as a result of sea level rise concerns. But there hasn't been a lot of addressing how you use that information and also doing it province-wide. We have some astronomical number of kilometers of coastline in this province, and so it's a very real issue. The other element to this that I think is important, Mr. Speaker, is that when you look at some of the goals, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party tried to make quite a lot about the fact that the current rate increases are related to the new targets in the government's legislation, and that's not entirely accurate. In fact, if you look at actually what they're dealing with before the board at the moment, they will be coming to deal with those new targets, there's no question, and yes, they will have a cost, and I think that's a worthy debate. But the costs that are actually being dealt with at the moment as they relate to renewable energy are actually the original targets in the original EGSPA legislation, which are still being met and have to be rounded out. And so, you know, the new targets are going to have their impact coming along, but of course I read in the paper, maybe the honourable member was misquoted, but I read that he said at his dinner on Sunday night that the party still supported the 40% goal. So I don't understand how you do both. So it seems to be two different messages there. One message on one bill and another message on another bill, or at a fundraising dinner. So at the end of the day, when we look at this, I think that what we need as we go forward, and maybe there'll be amendments that come forward that address this, there needs to be some hard and fast targets around. If we're going to have a green economy strategy, we need it yesterday. We don't need it 5 years. We don't need another delayed strategy. There's been a lot of delayed strategies. We don't need that. The goals are fine in and of themselves as long as we know when it's coming, what it will achieve, and we know that it won't be just a bunch of meaningless words that aren't followed or that sit on a shelf. It actually has to do something. It has to balance the real opportunities that exist in rural and urban Nova Scotia with the fact that you have to have people at work, you have to have people that are achieving things. And there are models around the world that we can look at. For example, if you look at Vermont, for example, and obviously everybody has their own unique circumstances, but Vermont has done a lot of work around taking a green economy and having a lot of more environmentally friendly energy sources and dealing with that in a way that actually has created jobs and different kinds of investment, and you actually see that. But the difference there is you actually see buy-in from people on a day-to-day basis. So you see buy-in from businesses. They've been able to make a business case for that. And that's what you need to do. You need to create a situation where people can actually create a business case around a green economy situation. The last thing that I wanted to address with related to this is I think that when feeding into all this is local agriculture and so forth, which I think feeds into this whole environmental goals and sustainable prosperity. There's been I think we're all aware that there's a larger move towards more sustainable foods, more sustainable forms of agriculture, more local purchasing, whether it's foods or products. And again, I'll use Vermont as an example. You go into many stores in Vermont and you look at your receipt, and the receipt has two portions. On the top, it tells you your subtotal of locally purchased goods, and on the bottom is your total. So every purchaser is aware, well, here's what I bought that supported the local economy. And I think there's things like that they don't always need legislation, but there are things that government can be involved in supporting, and maybe could be part of that green economy strategy, because that's something where people would go into a store every day and they would know what whether they bought and was local. Now, yes, there's all kinds of things. You got to decide what's local and what's not local. That's fine, but those can be worked out. That's a policy decision. But there are things that we can do. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll be interested to watch this as it moves forward. I think that we have to recognize that it is what it is. It adds to goals that are really no different. They obviously add different things, but they're no different in their tone or intent than the goals in the previous act. I think it should be concerning and disappointing for everybody, however, that there were goals in there that were not met, and that in many cases this is adding things in that are related to decisions that have already been made, and so this is retroactive legislation in that respect. And so we just need to understand that that's what it is and move forward. But my hope is that the government has actually looked at this to make sure that the goals that are in this now are achievable, because the last thing we ever want to have to come back and do again is to weaken a piece of legislation that was intended to be a model, and as many others have spoken to, has been a model in other places. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Hammond Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I have a pleasure to stand in my place to talk a little bit about this, the bill that's before us, the Green Energy Act. I think this is something that shows leadership for this government to bring forward to this chamber. This is, you know, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I know, and I've spoken to many Nova Scotians in the last 3 years, but in particular before I was elected as well, people who really believe that the environment is, that Nova Scotians do care about the environment, Mr. Speaker. For many years, we have kind of lagged the country in a vision for the environment, and I think that that we need to ensure that Nova Scotia is a leader, Mr. Speaker, and this is something that I think that this act does. As was mentioned previous, of course, through law, we have to do a review of the act, and this is the 5-year review that has been done, and these are the results of that review. Of some of the changes that are in the act now are good changes for Nova Scotians, linking our economy to the environment is something that New Democrats have been talking about for a very long time, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, New Democrats are proud for pushing that issue forward right across the country. When you look at like a province like Manitoba, for instance, who NDP has been in government since 1999, and Mr. Speaker, that province has a whole host of mechanisms of green energy, that the economy is built around the environment, and that's something that I think that New Democrats right across the country are proud for, and certainly this government is proud for as well, Mr. Speaker. I do want to recognize some comments that were made around this bill, and in particular that when we were in opposition the EGSPA Act was brought forward and was voted on in a minority government. So obviously it needed support of at least one opposition party, and we do know that all parties supported that act, which I think, Mr. Speaker, is a good thing. To know that all three parties in this legislature recognize that the environment and how we grow our economy moves forward with that. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think I did want to recognize that. As well as, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to thank the Roundtable for all of the work that they've done over the past number of years, and of course doing the review and working on behalf of Nova Scotians. You know, oftentimes we hear about agencies, boards, or commissions in this province who do great work, and this one in particular, Mr. Speaker, that they have been able to go out and consult with many different organizations across Nova Scotia to talk to them about how we can enhance this bill, and as we have before us right now, the Act, the Green Economy Act, and I'm proud to be able to stand here and talk a little bit about that. So talk about a little bit about the what it means for our future, about why this is a good bill, and as well as some of our accomplishments as a government in this regard, and how we build the economy of the future. And that, again, as I said, Mr. Speaker, that's something that, as a New Democrat, I've been proud to talk about. The many years that I've lived on this earth so far of being able to talk about that, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's something that you know, as a young Nova Scotian myself, a young adult in Nova Scotia, I think that we, you know, decisions have been made in the past that, you know, may not have been the best decisions. But, Mr. Speaker, I know that we need to make sure all legislators in this chamber ensure that we have a direction and a direction forward when it comes to our green economy. So, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to talk a little bit about how, you know, I know that we have Nova Scotia has been a world leader when it comes to the way that we recycle and we do our waste diversion. You know, we'll give recognition where it's due, where past governments have supported that. And I know that many different municipal units have moved forward with real leadership in that regard. So, Mr. Speaker, I do want to recognize that as well. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, there are a few things, just a few things, Mr. Speaker, that former governments have done to protect the environment. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's this government that will ensure a real future in protecting that environment. And you know, we know that past governments have kind of just set targets, then kind of just sat back and watched greenhouse gas emissions increase. We're taking action, and we've actually, in fact, Mr. Speaker, we've exceeded that expectation. The targets that set out for Nova Scotia. We set the first hard caps, Mr. Speaker, on greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And, Mr. Speaker, we were recognized as a province because of the leadership of this government. We have been recognized as a world leader, Mr. Speaker. The United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Copenhagen in 2009 recognized Nova Scotia as a world leader. As a world leader, Mr. Speaker. And I think that that's something quite impressive. For a small region of less than 1 million people, have been able to be a world leader in greenhouse gas emission targets, Mr. Speaker. That's something that we should be proud of as Nova Scotians. That's something that we should be proud of, Mr. Speaker. We came into power, Mr. Speaker, where wind power construction had stalled, and 90% of Nova Scotia's energy came from coal. Now, I've stood on my feet many times, Mr. Speaker, and talked about what that did for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Not only environmental concerns, Mr. Speaker, but it concerned people when it came to their power rates, Mr. Speaker. We've talked about that in the past, that we have always had this kind of We've been, as I say, and the Premier says, we've been shackled to coal, Mr. Speaker. And I think that ensuring that we are able to at least diversify the energy that we produce in Nova Scotia is something that we should do, Mr. Speaker. We should diversify the energy that we produce to allow us to move forward to meet certain targets, Mr. Speaker. And as we've mentioned as well, I mean, we were the government that took a renewable electricity plan that actually put in legislation, Mr. Speaker, that by 2015, 25% of the power that we produce is renewable energy. And so one of the things that I think is also key to recognize is that as of April 24th this year, Mr. Speaker, that 20% of Nova Scotians' power needs were met by wind power. Wow. That's leadership, Mr. Speaker. It's something that, as I stand in my place as a proud New Democrat, that we are the party of the environment, Mr. Speaker. That's something that as people, you know, people like Tommy Douglas, Jack Layton would be very proud of, Mr. Speaker. And I think that is something that we should be proud of. Now, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that there's someone who wants to do an introduction. So I think the Minister of Rural Economic Development would like to do an introduction.
Thank you. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Upper Hammonds Plains for allowing me to make this introduction. I'd like to bring the attention of the House to the East Gallery. In the East Gallery today, we have a former chair of NSBI. Actually, this gentleman was chair of NSBI when we came into government, and I would like Mr. Hall to stand up and receive the applause of the House.
Thank you. Now recognize the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and glad to see people coming down to take a look at democracy in action, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, as I was talking about was our renewable electricity plan, renewable electricity strategy that really is about turning our dependence on coal around. We shouldn't be shackled to coal anymore, Mr. Speaker, but at least diversify the energy that we produce in Nova Scotia. So I talked about the 25% renewable target by 2015. That's in legislation. But the other thing that is in legislation, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that by 2020, 40% of our energy that we produce will now be renewable energy. Mr. Speaker, that is, I think, again, something that is that puts us as a leader in Canada and around the world. This is something that will move Nova Scotia forward. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, that I've stood in this place before, talking about, you know, when you travel across Nova Scotia, in particular when you're coming home from, when you're away, maybe you might be visiting New Brunswick, or you might be driving home from a shopping trip to the States, or maybe PEI, and you travel across the Nova Scotia-New Brunswick border. And when you see the Tantramar Marsh and you see the number of windmills, I think there's 15 of them there, Mr. Speaker, 15 windmills. Now that's, you know, Mr. Speaker, when you come back home and you see that, I see that as a picture of progress. Not only when we come home from away from New Brunswick or the other areas that I mentioned, but also, Mr. Speaker, as I love to drive through the Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, when you look up when you look over the hills, Mr. Speaker, and you see the windmills, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about energy today, Mr. Speaker, not necessarily about pavement. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that's a good thing, that this bill will allow us to move forward. When we see those windmills, it's a project of the future, Mr. Speaker, that allows us to, when you look there, it shows that Nova Scotia is progressing as a province, Mr. Speaker. So now, Mr. Speaker, as part of that renewable electricity plan is the plan to ensure that Nova Scotians receive a benefit from Muskrat Falls. Muskrat Falls is, again, a project that I think will bring great benefits, not only in the area of renewable electricity, but in jobs, Mr. Speaker. It's exactly what this bill has always been intended to do, to link our economic growth to sustainable environment, Mr. Speaker. That's something that we need to continue to do, Mr. Speaker. And that project will have direct benefits to Nova Scotians, allowing them to have stable energy rates for the future. Mr. Speaker, another thing that was in that renewable electricity plan, something that this bill, the electricity plan certainly was a result of this bill, was the whole idea of a community feed-in tariff. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, in particular in my own constituency, there have been talks with two groups in particular. One is in the community of Upper Hammonds Plains, where there's a consortium of small companies who are coming together who want to create energy, and they want to put up windmills, Mr. Speaker. And what I find is a very interesting thing, Mr. Speaker, is that the group of companies who came together to talk about the to produce wind energy, do you know what they did, Mr. Speaker? They went to the community immediately. They consulted with an historic African Nova Scotian community up front, told them, this is our vision. We want you to be part of it, Mr. Speaker. And I was glad to be able to be at the community the community consultation that they had, talking about it. There are some myths about wind energy, Mr. Speaker. Some myths and truths that I think that the community wanted to hear from the company. That they will have long-term benefit. And one of the interesting things, Mr. Speaker, about that community feed-in tariff is that wherever that project, the community feed-in tariff project is, the profits from that, some of them, a percentage of them, need to go back to the community. So, for instance, I think that's a good thing, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's a sensible thing. And so one of the things that they said was, well, let's talk about what that looks like. And do you know what the people of Upper Hammonds Plains said, Mr. Speaker? They said, let's invest that money into our community center. So a perfect example of not only a net benefit for the people people of Nova Scotia to meet their greenhouse gas emissions, but they're in fact investing in the area in which that project is taking place. So I think, Mr. Speaker, that is something positive about moving forward on that exact thing around that this bill is doing, this Green Economy Act is doing for the people of Nova Scotia. And I think that is just one example of many projects across Nova Scotia that are allowing us to move forward with this whole idea. Mr. Speaker, some of the other things that we talked about, not only in this act, but in other things that we've done as government, is this whole notion of one of our very first acts, actually, Mr. Speaker, one of our very first legislative acts was to enact a moratorium on uranium mining, Mr. Speaker. An action that previous governments just didn't really do. So I have an article, Mr. Speaker, back from October 22nd, 2009. And I find it interesting, though, because, of course, I think that was our very first legislative session as a government. And I remember sitting in my chair, which is actually one chair over, and I remember sitting there, Mr. Speaker, and a member from the Conservative caucus stood up and introduced a bill around the same thing. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? That member was in the backbench for many years, for 3 anyways I know of, and he didn't have the leadership to stand up and do it when they were in government. So I think that is something that's important. And I'll read a quote from the president of the Citizens Action to Protect the Environment, Mr. Speaker. It says, our group has worked to bring this issue to the attention of the public, and we are extremely pleased that this government has followed through on their commitment during the election. Wow, that is significant. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table that article for the members of the House. For the members of the House, which I think is a positive thing that we should put out. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, that we did was an indefinite ban set at Georges Bank. Something, Mr. Speaker, that I know the member for Shelburne, the Minister of the Environment, talked a lot about since he has been in this House since 2006. He was not only the member in the opposition, but he's also the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture, Mr. Speaker. He spoke about that during the 2009 election campaign, and our party committed to doing that, Mr. Speaker. And again, one of our very first bills that we brought forward as a government was just that. And a coalition, Mr. Speaker, of environmentalists, Aboriginal communities, and fishermen, quote, says, pleased with the province's direction on this file. The same group says, Mr. Speaker, quote, applauds this forward-thinking action by the Premier and his government, Mr. Speaker, something that we committed to doing and something that we followed through on, Mr. Speaker. So that's another something that we would love to do. I know that the people talked about that being the story of the year, Mr. Speaker. The story of the year for, in particular, Southwest Nova Scotia and the fishers along that coast. So, Mr. Speaker, that's another positive thing that we do. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, that I wanted to mention was around this bill of the green economy. Something that we did do, Mr. Speaker, was around, we knew that previous governments didn't necessarily have the leadership abilities to bring forward good policy and good legislation that would actually make a difference in people's lives. But that whole question of restricting pesticides, Mr. Speaker. Our government put in place legislation and regulations restricting non-essential pesticides in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And these rules, when they took effect, Mr. Speaker, the David Suzuki Foundation announced that in comparison of existing provincial pesticides law across Canada, Nova Scotia now has the strictest laws in the country, Mr. Speaker. That's something that we should celebrate. Something that we should celebrate, that whole question of our green economy and how we build an economy for the future is just another example of how we've been able to move forward on that front, Mr. Speaker. So we know that some decisions, Mr. Speaker, aren't necessarily easy. We need to take time. We need to do it right. And I think that's what Nova Scotians elected us to do, no matter what party you're in. I think people recognize and want them to know, Nova Scotians want us to know that we need to take the time to make the right choices for them and their families. And I know that I certainly do that on a day-to-day basis, Mr. Speaker. On a day-to-day basis, we shouldn't just make decisions off the cuff, but in fact study it, take a look at it. Again, the opposition today was talking about consultation and, around, they were going on about something. They wanted consultation. But, Mr. Speaker, the other day, the Minister of Community Services stood up and said, they said, oh, well, we shouldn't be doing consultation. So, again, Mr. Speaker, it's just one of those things that the Liberal Party goes on about. Nova Scotians shouldn't really pay attention to what they're saying anyways. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the things, a few other things, Mr. Speaker, and then I'll take my seat. But I'll recognize also Eco Nova Scotia. So by 2012, the $42.5 million Eco Nova Scotia Fund for clean air and climate change initiatives generated millions of dollars of wages and reduced greenhouse gas emissions by an estimated 241,000 tons, Mr. Speaker. That's the equivalent, Mr. Speaker, of taking 53,000 cars off the road. Mr. Speaker, that is something that Nova Scotians should recognize, and we should be out there telling them those things, and that we can do more, Mr. Speaker. We can do more to protect our environment, and I'm really proud that this government is doing that, Mr. Speaker. The last thing I do want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is around this whole question of large land purchase program, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know the Liberal Party will stand in their place and talk about that being buying dirt. They've said that on the record, Mr. Speaker. Well, shame on them. Because I know in our caucus, when we talk in our caucus, and I hear from my colleagues from Southwest Nova Scotia and the South Shore, how important that is for that region to ensure that they have, that we meet our target, Mr. Speaker, of 12% of Nova Scotia's land will be protected by 2015. And the opposition calls it buying dirt. Nova Scotia was at the bottom of the barrel, Mr. Speaker, when it came to that in the past. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's move forward. Let's ensure that we meet those targets, Mr. Speaker, and it will be this government that meets that target, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, there is two other things that I did want to mention. Of course, I have some notes here. I did want to mention one issue around, and I think the member from Clayton Park and even the member from Bedford Birch Cove might be interested in this. Well, actually, I was going to mention something that our three constituencies might have in common, and that is the whole question of Highway 113. So, Mr. Speaker, I remember before I was elected, the leader of the opposition, or the Conservative Party, the government of the day, put forward this whole question of environmental assessment around that proposed highway. That's been on there for a while, been on the books for a while, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting because one of the things that they did was they did an environmental assessment. And under the environmental assessment regulations, they said that anything over a road any more than 10 kilometers long had to do more of a rigorous environmental assessment. So what happened, Mr. Speaker, was by accident, I would assume, by accident, the highway came in at 9.9 kilometers long. Interesting, eh? So what happened was they decided not to include the off-ramps and the on-ramps, which brings it down below 10 kilometers. So they didn't have to do a rigorous environmental assessment, Mr. Speaker. But I bet you dollars to donuts, Mr. Speaker, that if they had done an environmental assessment that was more rigorous, they would probably found that the area in which that highway is proposed to go through is an environmentally sensitive area, probably one of the most environmentally sensitive area in the province. It's a beautiful place to get out and talk. So, Mr. Speaker, that's what the Conservative Party did when they were in government. The other thing that I want to highlight, Mr. Speaker, and I will take my place, is around the whole question of CP Allen High School. Being built, I hear the member from Bedford Birch Cove saying, oh, here we go again. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's this government that's building that school. And I see the member from Bedford Birch Cove had a newsletter out later in the week taking credit for the school. Oh. So you know, Mr. Speaker, I find it interesting when she goes on over there about that. So, but what I will mention, Mr. Speaker, is that school is a gold LEED standard, Mr. Speaker. The first public school to be built as a gold LEED standard, Mr. Speaker. Something very positive, something that is creating green jobs in Nova Scotia and that will ensure a better future for all Nova Scotians. And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will take my place. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll take a few minutes to make a comment or two, perhaps on Bill 136 and maybe a couple other things along the way here, Mr. Speaker. Interesting, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, but you know, I had a briefing 8 or 10 days ago, a week or so ago now, from the Minister of Environment's staff on this proposed amendments to the bill, 136 as we've seen it presented. And, you know, we talk about what's in the bill and really the importance of the bill. And there's 6 slides here, Mr. Speaker. 3 of them have nothing on them. You know, and 2 of them say the same thing. Even when the minister opened and moved the second reading of this bill, I was sitting here, pen in hand, waiting to hear something more detailed about what the proposed amendments might be, about what his new goals, the 2 new goals he set might be, but they were very brief. Not much detail in any of that, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, so I guess we'll figure that out as we go along like we do with a lot of other things. You know, I looked at the numbers he gave. I think they were 86% for those that have completed the drinking water, the municipal units, and 90+%, 90+% anyway, thank you, of the wastewater. And you know, I wonder, do we need to change legislation or amend legislation to be able to make it happen for the balance? And that's a pretty good number. 86 and 91, 90% or so are pretty good numbers overall when we really think about where we've been in the last number of years and the struggles that municipal units have had financially, especially in the last couple of years, to be able to meet these demands. And 90, I'm just looking for a correction there. 91%, thank you, Minister. Wondering if we really needed to put forward legislation. Is there another way? You know, when I was asked about this, I said, maybe there was another way. Why aren't we sitting down, all 3 levels of government, maybe having a discussion? Do we really need to change the goals that were set? Because I was here in 1997 when this bill was put forward, and if I recall, it was a bill that was passed unanimously with good debate. There was a fair bit of debate on it. It was a good bill, and I think that most would still agree that it remains a bill that was worthy of putting forward in this House, showing the leadership of the province of Nova Scotia as we move toward renewables, as we've been doing a lot of different things by way of recycling. We are known for a variety of things when it comes to the cleanliness of our province. And was there another way to sit down with these municipal units that existed and say, how can we get you where we need you to be in the time frame that's been set out? Because we felt it was important then, but now we're willing to move on that. And what's interesting about that is we're willing to move on that, but yet just the opposite we went with our environmental goals with regards to what the member was just talking about a few minutes ago around energy. We've upped that, and you know, he talks about the renewable energy plan. Well, I can tell you, he talks about all the things that they're number 1 at. I'll tell you a couple things are number 1 at, Mr. Speaker's increased taxes. We're number 1 there. Job loss, we're number 1 there. Giving money away to corporations, Mr. Speaker, that a lot of people deem as wasteful. That is not benefiting them at all, not even in the short or long term. We need to be better than that, Mr. Speaker. But that member goes on and he'll give the political spiel that someone wrote a speech for him to stand up on his feet today and reel off over there in his spot, and that's fine. That's what the government backbench does, I guess, in the current government, and somebody has to do it, and I guess he was elected today to do so. Mr. Speaker, you know, we look at Muskrat Falls. Nobody argued in this House ever. I've not heard one member stand in this House in his or her place and say, Mr. Speaker, that the idea of clean, renewable, green energy is not a good thing. I think that every member in this House believes that that is, in fact, the way that we need to go. I know that I've stood in my place here on many occasions and I've asked in question period of the Premier and of the Minister, what is the cost? Well, I can tell you we don't know the cost, but yet the member will stand up and say, this is a good plan for Nova Scotia. The direction that he's heading and that party is heading is bankrupting the province, Mr. Speaker, nothing more. When you don't know what the costs are, and we know, we've seen a week or so ago where costs jumped another $1 billion+. Oh, the member can continue to chirp away over there because he knows. Unless he's got the answer, perhaps he should be sitting in the front seat there on the front bench beside the Minister of Finance. Maybe he's the guy, that fella from Guy's Brochet Harbour down there, because he seems to know any other time when he's asked what all the answers are, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? He don't know. He doesn't know it all. If he did, he'd get on his feet, and I'll give him the opportunity to get on his feet if he wants. If he's got the cost and the breakdown and the answer to what the renewables in this province and the plan that the NDP has put forward is going to cost, then he should get up and tell all the rest of his party members and government that he knows better than all of them who are working at this, who are working at all of this, but yet he knows the answer because he's always right, I guess, Mr. Speaker, in his opinion anyway. Thankfully, it's only his opinion. And when we look at Muskrat Falls, we're not saying this project is not worthy of looking at. Mr. Speaker, we're saying, what's the cost? What are the alternatives? Nobody wants to go there. One focus. One focus is all they have. That focus is the wrong focus. You need to be more than that. You need to do more than that. The people of Nova Scotia deserve better than that. We have put forward ideas with regards to energy. You know, we talk about a variety of different bills in this House, and they're all related when you think about the long-term sustainable goals in this House. environmentally friendly energy, they're one and the same when you really think about it, and we've heard a bit about that today. They all will impact this environmental goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. What do we see in the bill? Definitions of what sustainable means. How can that be? Mr. Speaker, you know, we need to be talking about the realities of life in Nova Scotia, and that is, it is hard times for Nova Scotians. They are struggling to pay power bills. We are saying freeze the rates now, not in 2 years. That would be a great target. You know, you want to talk about targets in this House. You want to talk about targets for environmental prosperity, goals that can be met, freeze them now. Allow people to benefit from that. Lower taxes, Mr. Speaker. Allow people to benefit from that. Will that have an impact in this province? We know that it does. We know increasing taxes does nothing to grow the economy. It slows the economy. We've seen it in the last 2 or 3 years. We know that. People are not spending. 2% may not sound like much, Mr. Speaker. May not sound like much, but it's a lot on those big purchases. And now, you know, we look at this bill, and he mentions, the minister mentioned in his briefing, or the staff did, reframing objectives and adding key outcomes. Adding 2 new goals, Mr. Speaker, related to cleaner sources, the sustainable use of energy, and advancing the growth of the green economy, he states in this slide. He didn't give much detail, Mr. Speaker, when he stood on his feet today and introduced this bill for second reading. As I said, I thought there would have been more in it, but, you know, people are saying, what does that mean? You know, there were comments and other documentation that was handed out. Increasing horizontal governments. What does that mean? Most people would ask you. Change how we report progress to include work happening in government that goes beyond the 21 goals. Reframing objectives and identifying key outcomes. Amend the long-term objective to be more clear, measurable, and achievable. But we're already seeing that we don't even know that the goals that they're putting in place, i.e. the energy goals, are achievable. Right now, they're not. Not even at the current prices that we're allowing to move upward. They're not achievable. We won't be here long enough to worry about them being achievable. Many more businesses will be out of business, small and large. People are moving away from this province, unfortunately, every day. We had a good meeting in Hansport this morning, and talking to the folks at Minas Basin, Mr. Speaker, about other alternatives. And you know what they're saying? Yeah, there's a few options in the long term, maybe. But what we do know for certain is that there will be people out of work by the end of the year. That is very unfortunate. Tough decision, business decisions, hard to be in that industry, energy related. Energy costs are one of their biggest factors, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? They're leaving, Mr. Speaker. There's people that will leave that place and will leave this province to seek out employment because they have to be able to feed their families, Mr. Speaker. That's reasonable. We know that. That's been happening for years. We're still seeing it, and we're seeing it at even greater numbers now. When we look at the bills going through this House, we have to ask ourselves, Mr. Speaker, what are we doing that is benefiting Nova Scotians? And most of the time when you look at these bills, some of these bills that we've seen gone through have been, you know, a few words to change a clause or amend something. They're doing nothing to bring employment to this province. They're doing nothing to create jobs. They're doing nothing to lower taxes. But we just keep spending money we don't have. Spending money that your granddaughter, grandson, Mr. Speaker, great-granddaughters and children beyond, after you're long gone, Mr. Speaker, will still be paying for the mistakes that have been made in the last 3 years. And that is taxes. And those are the reality of the mistakes. Mr. Speaker, let's be honest. How much farther in debt is this province? $1.5 billion? Mr. Speaker, in the last 3 years, $1.5 billion. More debt per year. More debt per year. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, what people can't even imagine what $1.5 billion means. They'd be struggling if that were the only debt, wondering how are we going to pay that, but that's okay. Keep spending what you don't have. That's the idea. Keep spending what you don't have. And Mr. Speaker, as we draw closer to the election, you see announcement after announcement after announcement daily on more money being spent. Oh, we know the election will come whether it's next year or the year after. There is a limit, fortunately, to the time a government can stay without with having to call election. Fortunately, that does exist in this province. And hopefully that will come sooner rather than later, Mr. Speaker, because people are waiting. And I've traveled around this province and talked to people, and they say, yeah, you know what, we supported that party, Mr. Speaker, but I'll tell you what, we'll never do it again. And there's a reason for that, and they'll tell you those reasons. Broken promises are a lot of that, Mr. Speaker. Putting forward electricity plans that are unaffordable, Mr. Speaker, is the reality of people in this province. Those are the stories, Mr. Speaker, that people are telling us. Those are the real truths. that are going on in this province. And all of those members over there know the difficulties that members in their areas are having. This is not new. Every industry is struggling. We know that times are tough around the world economically, and we should be working hard to do better, Mr. Speaker. But instead, we're willing to put forward bills that are 2 or 3 slides long or a few words. Mr. Speaker, with any luck, Mr. Speaker, the 14% and the 19% we'll probably see this as an opportunity to extend and give them a little relief from the financial pressures that they are going through. And having been a former councillor, I can appreciate that, especially in small town areas where I know that it's very difficult to come up with money. All you have is the tax base. A good example, we're going to see huge tax losses in the town of Hantsport. Again, we lost funding. That was a huge jump. We're going to see another, with Minus Basin closing, there'll be another drop in the tax base, Mr. Speaker. And that's just one example. There are a lot of towns and a lot of municipal units that are losing that revenue, but yet we're asking more. So this will be an opportunity for those municipal units, although I think we should have sat down and said, is there a better way? Is there another way that we can help you, Mr. Speaker? So it'll be interesting to see if the UNSM or other representatives from municipal units come in during law amendments to speak to Bill 136. Perhaps they will. Maybe they won't. Maybe they're content with it the way it is. But it will pass through this House just like every other bill does, even when amendments are put forward. And good amendments get put forward at times, Mr. Speaker, in this House. But unfortunately, we've seen that go by the wayside and not supported, not even considered, Mr. Speaker. I know from listening to my colleagues that sit in law amendments that bills are put up and bills are shot down, or amendments, I should say, are put up and shot down quickly because that's not what government wants. Government has their agenda. It's been set. So it's frustrating, Mr. Speaker, to some degree that we can come into this House and stand and offer our comments on behalf of the people that we represent, but to no avail, because in the end of the day, we really don't have any control over what the outcome will be, because government does not appear to be interested in listening to what the opposition members have to offer in this House, Mr. Speaker. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I will say thank you and take my seat on Bill 136.
Thank you. I would now like to recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to direct your gaze to the East Gallery and to recognize a dear friend of mine from the South Shore who's relocated to Halifax, Lucine Toomey. Lucine is known in my area as a very successful realtor, and I became good friends with her when she joined the board of Second Story Women's Centre when I was the chair of that board. So I ask everyone in the House to give her a warm welcome.
The Honourable Member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in my place to speak to the amendment to the Acts of 2007, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. Mr. Speaker, I will probably echo some of the comments that have already been made by my colleagues and others in the chamber about the importance of the environment to the majority of Nova Scotians. The environment is one that is near and dear to a lot of our hearts. And most Nova Scotians will tell you that they value, respect, and appreciate all of our natural resources. And certainly this province is blessed with many natural resources in our province, and resources that have contributed to the economy of Nova Scotia for many, many, many generations. And some of those natural resources, Mr. Speaker, whether we're talking about our agricultural lands or whether we're talking about our forest lands, our fisheries and aquaculture, our minerals, Mr. Speaker, whether we're talking about our coastlines, our river systems, our watershed areas that would include the many hundreds of lakes that are seen throughout our beautiful province here. And whether we're talking about water or air quality, energy efficiency, Mr. Speaker, or renewable, sustainable energy production, all of these, this bounty that we have in this province of natural resources and needs through energy are ones that Nova Scotians appreciate and truly respect. And Nova Scotians also understand the need to not only sustain our natural environment, but also to sustain our economy. And here in 2012, I think most of us can say that most people right across the globe now are talking about a green economy and how we can shift from the industrial age that saw much of the damage to air and water quality. We have taken a shift, and we understand that we can no longer sustain ourselves environmentally if we are to continue on that destructive path of uncontrolled industries that have contributed much to our damaged environment. So we understand the need to find a balance between protecting and preserving our quality of life and our environment, while at the same time prospering in our economy. And I'm proud to say, Mr. Speaker, that this act actually allows us to continue on the path that we have struck in attaining our environmental goals and sustainable prosperity here in the province, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to highlight some of the goals that we have already achieved, Mr. Speaker, since coming into office in 2009, and under the direction of the Premier and the Minister of Environment and the other ministers that sit around the cabinet table play a huge role in our environmental sustainable goals and our economic goals. Some of those that we have achieved, Mr. Speaker, is we have tabled a natural resources strategy that has been welcomed right across this province. And that natural resources strategy, Mr. Speaker, if you recall, had the input of hundreds of Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other, Nova Scotians who clearly understood that we needed a strong strategy in place to start looking at how we can best utilize our natural resources here in the province. We also rolled out the water resource management strategy, Mr. Speaker, and this is a strategy that is so important to the province because we have a vast area of watersheds across this province. We rely on our water resources, of course, for drinking. Absolutely, it's important that we have a strategy in place that looks at managing our quality of drinking water here in this province, and we also need to have that strategy in place to manage the rest of our water resources. You know, we see in many parts of the world, Mr. Speaker, where water is becoming a scarce commodity. And it is indeed a commodity, Mr. Speaker. And, many of us remember when water was rolled out in bottled form, and now, a lot of people purchase water, and that seems kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes, to know something that we take for granted. So having a water resource management strategy in place is very important here in the province. Our wetland conservation policy, Mr. Speaker, is a policy that I know has been in the works for a few years now. Many people have come around the table to really make a policy that speaks to the importance of our wetlands, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased that our government has achieved that goal in seeing that policy come forward. We also have emission standards for greenhouse gases for new motor vehicles, Mr. Speaker, and that's so important too, as we see daily reports on climate and our changes to climate, and how greenhouse gas emissions have been a contributing factor to our accelerating climate changing. And so it's very important that we have put those standards out in place. We also have targeted the building codes in terms of the energy efficiency requirements now for new building structures. And this too is really important, Mr. Speaker, because we generate a lot of energy here in the province. A lot of dirty energy has been generated for many, many, many years, Mr. Speaker. And we need to get a handle on not only our energy use here in the province, but we have to understand our own responsibilities to looking at better efficient uses of energy. And so part of that is putting in place building code requirements for new builds, Mr. Speaker, so that new construction has already been taken into account ways that we can increase our energy efficient components in those new builds. Mr. Speaker, we have all been riveted to the debate in this House around the Bowater Mersey lands, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that not only is this government, my government, in intense negotiations with Resolute in terms of acquiring those Mersey lands, but that my government has taken very seriously our protection goals of 12% of Nova Scotia's land by 2015, Mr. Speaker. And this negotiated situation with Resolute and the government is very important to some of those lands. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, could help us reach our attainable goal of 12% protected lands here in Nova Scotia by 2015. But also, Mr. Speaker, those lands have much value in terms of the forest resource of this province. Most of us are aware that the Bowater Mersey lands is the single most largest private land holding here in the province. So the government initiative in sitting down at the table and negotiating with Resolute into the potential possibility of this province acquiring 550,000 acres, Mr. Speaker, of prime forest land, and also land that has the potential to reach our 12% goal of protected lands here in the province. I'm very proud of my government for being involved in that. Mr. Speaker, we also have put forward many great pieces of legislation over the past couple of years. One of them is the non-essential pesticides piece of legislation, and that was introduced and became effective April 1st, 2011. And that piece of legislation, prior to its becoming law, Mr. Speaker, many people had written members here in the House and had contacted department staff people on the urgency of moving forward with this non-essential pesticide ban, Mr. Speaker. You know, especially in urban or suburban areas where homeowners live fairly in close proximity to each other, you can well imagine some of the stress for some of the neighbors who perhaps were not engaged in the use of non-essential pesticides to those residents who perhaps were using quite frequently pesticides that were for more or less lawn beautification. And so the majority of Nova Scotians that were reaching out to members were signaling that this wasn't an essential need in a lot of communities, and indeed pesticides have been known to cause any number of illnesses, from asthma to other illnesses. Mr. Speaker, I'm looking at a couple of pages of notes here, so I may be kind of getting a little off track here. Mr. Speaker, another piece of legislation that this government has put forward, and that is the anti-idling legislation. Now, I think that's a very important piece of legislation that we were able to see move forward, and it is the first of its kind in Canada, and it requires, Mr. Speaker, that the provincial government, school and tour bus operators and transit authorities have anti-idling policies in place, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, when I travel here into the city from Queens and I'm coming into the Rotary, the traffic is I mean, it's not the same amount of traffic that I see in the riding of Queens. And when I'm sitting in traffic for periods of time, the exhaust that emits from idling cars, it's just incredible, Mr. Speaker. And so this piece of legislation, anti-idling legislation, I think is a very progressive piece of legislation. When you think of all of the vehicles that are on our highways and on our streets in our city here and in our suburban areas, concentrated in, you know, hundreds of vehicles at early hour traffic and afternoon traffic, it's just incredible the amount of exhaust that is pumping into the air. So this was a very good piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. George's Bank. I remember standing in my place and speaking to that bill in 2010, and I was very proud of this government for putting that ban in place to protect George's Bank, which is one of the most sensitive marine areas and traditional fishing grounds here. And of course, I had mentioned how important our natural resources are, and fisheries being one of them. So I was pleased back then in 2010 to speak to that legislation, and I'm very pleased that that legislation has been well received right across the province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Churchill's Falls and the development of the Muskrat Falls is certainly something that we on this side of the House are looking forward to seeing it come to fruition. Mr. Speaker, I know that the government of Newfoundland, I believe it was in yesterday's paper, or it could have been in this morning's paper, the government there is looking forward to accelerating that project, and I think here in Nova Scotia, we too are looking to have that project accelerated. That certainly will meet a lot of our goals in terms of reducing our greenhouse emissions, Mr. Speaker. When we start seeing renewable energy to the degree that Muskrat Falls and Churchill Falls will see pumping renewable energy into our energy stream, Mr. Speaker, we can indeed at that point in time say that we are moving forward to sustainable renewable energy, and it will certainly benefit the economy during the production phase, during the design phase of that project, Mr. Speaker. We will see many jobs secured throughout the many phases of that project, Mr. Speaker, and I am very pleased that this government has taken on the initiative and is partnering with Newfoundland and Labrador to see that project roll out, Mr. Speaker. Now, the members on the opposite side of the House have not committed to standing up and agreeing with this particular project. In fact, some of them will argue that, you know, it's a little bit too big. We haven't given enough information. It doesn't meet all of our energy needs in the future. I would beg to differ, Mr. Speaker. I would say that indeed it does meet some of our needs for our energy future, and in fact, I would say that it meets a lot of our targets for our energy in the future, and it is renewable. renewable, Mr. Speaker, and that's something that we need to keep reminding not only the members on the other side of the House, but we have to remind people that this is a renewable source of energy, and we all know that other sources of energy that we have existed on for generations, coal is certainly a finite resource, Mr. Speaker. Natural gas is a finite resource, Mr. Speaker. Other types of energy sources are certainly finite. Energy being produced through the Muskrat Falls project and Churchill Falls, Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a renewable resource. And so I'm looking forward to that project being accelerated, Mr. Speaker. And I know that Nova Scotians over time, they too will be looking forward to that because again, as I said in the beginning, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians truly do take pride in respect and value their natural environment, Mr. Speaker, and that includes energy. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about our climate change leadership that this government has demonstrated since we came into office in 2009. Mr. Speaker, we were the first government to set hard caps on greenhouse gases in Canada, and Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, is the only province in Canada to place those hard caps in the electricity sector, Mr. Speaker. And that initiative alone, and I'm very proud to say, has earned us awards at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Copenhagen, Mr. Speaker, and that's a very important designation to have, to receive an award from a United Nations body that truly recognize leadership roles in addressing climate change. And Mr. Speaker, we only need to look around the globe to see how serious climate change actually is, and that we indeed do have to address address that issue aggressively. You know, we only need to look just here a few short weeks ago when Hurricane Sandy swept through New Jersey and New York City, Mr. Speaker, and what damage you know, such a storm can have on whole neighborhoods and large cities, Mr. Speaker. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, some might argue, well, was Hurricane Sandy a direct result of climate change? Perhaps, perhaps not, Mr. Speaker. But I think we can all agree that we have seen many global disasters over the last several years that have some inkling of perhaps something is a little off with our climate. And so we need to be mindful that we have to keep setting targeted goals for us, and this government is indeed on track doing that. Mr. Speaker, we can look outside the window today and it's a beautiful sunny day. It's a little cool, but nonetheless, it's a beautiful sunny day. And we can look at the past several months here in the province, and we have had record-breaking temperatures, Mr. Speaker, and we need to start looking at ways that we can start to better facilitate many of our economies. I'm thinking of the agricultural industry, Mr. Speaker, that may need to adapt itself to changing climate here in the province. So we need to start thinking about those things, and certainly this government has indeed started thinking about ways to start addressing our changing climate through those hard caps on greenhouse gas emissions, Mr. Speaker, and certainly projects like the Muskrat and Churchill Falls project also will address some of those emissions targets that we need to reach. And that, in turn, Mr. Speaker, over time, will take some of the pressure off of our greenhouse gas emissions, which indeed, at the end of the day, affects our climate, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're all responsible for our environment, and we're also all responsible for how our economy emerges. And not only is it the responsibility for government to take leadership on how we protect and preserve our environment, and at the same time looking at ways that we can continue to economically benefit from our environment. But there are many people in our communities that also have taken leadership roles in protecting our environment. And I just want to point out a few of my constituents, or maybe more than a few of my constituents, Mr. Speaker, who have taken leadership roles not only in protecting and preserving the environment, but they're also looking at environmental protection through an economic lens, if you will, Mr. Speaker. And also these constituents have partnered with government and other leaders over time. And I just want to bring your attention to some of those people. The Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute, Mr. Speaker, in Kempt, Queens County, is a collection of staff, board, and volunteers, and they certainly understand the importance of a sustainable environment and how it relates to our economy, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I just want to highlight some of those individuals. Wendy Wynot. Wendy is the office manager of the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute. We have Amanda Lavers, who is the executive director. Jeffy McNeil, a project administrator. Tom Neely, who is a botanist. Alan Beliveau is ecosystems researcher, Mr. Speaker. And Benna Kehoe is a forest stewardship coordinator with the Research Institute. Lindsay Beals is an aquatic health researcher. Jesse Ciroli is a green technologies coordinator, Mr. Speaker, and also a researcher on the species at risk, the ribbon snake, Mr. Speaker. Brad Toms, who is a wildlife biologist. Jane Barker is the community outreach coordinator, and Hannah Blanchard is a research assistant with the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute. They have some current researchers on their staff. There is Anna Naylor, and Anna, she is a researcher in old growth forest structure and composition. And Christine Angelatis, I'm not sure if I pronounced her name properly, but she is also a researcher in old growth forest structure, Mr. Speaker. The current board of the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute consists of Andrew Ross, and Andrew is a forestry teacher at the Nova Scotia Community College. Andrea Wigger, and she is a present board member. We have Cindy Stasier, and Cindy is a professor at Dalhousie University. Colin Gray is also a present board member, and Colin is a retired police officer, Mr. Speaker, and a local naturalist, and I understand that Colin is the chair of the board. We have Jill Kamoli, and Jill is a retired health administrator and a naturalist. And we have Jillian Weldon Genet. We have John Gillen. We have Leif Heimer, who is with the Nova Scotia Community College. We have Mike Silver, who is with the Department of Natural Resources, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned earlier, the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute staff and board members do partner with government, and Mike has been with the Department of Natural Resources for many, many years, and Mike, I've known him for a number of years now, and he's just an all-around great guy, and certainly has worked admirably in the Department of Natural Resources. There's also Peter Rogers that sits on the board, Mr. Speaker, and Peter Rogers is a community member and also a retired business person. We have Pierre Martel, and Pierre is also a community member, and he is also a park warden, Mr. Speaker. Rob Cameron is with the Nova Scotia Department of Environment, and Rob works in the protected areas. Ron Russell's a St. Mary's University professor, and Steve Mockford, who is a professor with the Acadia University. Tom Herman, he is Vice President of Academic Acadia University Vice Chair, VP. He's in Kentville. Mr. Speaker, some of the other volunteers, Diane Clapp, she is the treasurer, and she also looks after some of the research around the species at risk, the Blandings turtle. Harold Clapp is also a volunteer, and he helps with research in lichens, mosses, turtles, and cougars, Mr. Speaker. And Jeff Kraft. Jeff researches geology, natural history, and he does a lot of the maintenance and the groundskeeping, and Jeff is from Greenfield, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to highlight all of those individuals that have come together under the umbrella of the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, and congratulate all of those folks on their leadership in the environment, understanding the need to protect our natural environment. But they also recognize, Mr. Speaker, the importance of a green economy and how a green economy certainly works hand in hand with a preserved environment. I also want to point to another interesting designation that Queens has recently have been awarded. UNESCO has recently designated a part of the riding of Queens. It's known as the Southwest Nova Biosphere, Mr. Speaker, and this piece of land, Mr. Speaker, it stretches not only throughout Queens, but it stretches into the Annapolis Valley, Mr. Speaker, in parts of Shelburne and in Digby, I believe, Mr. Speaker. And this tract of land, Mr. Speaker, is so incredibly important to Southwest Nova because it features the largest protected wilderness area in the Maritimes, Mr. Speaker. That is huge. And again, it is the largest protected wilderness area in the Maritimes. And this tract of land is so rich in cultural history and heritage landscape, Mr. Speaker. It boasts Acadian forests, Mr. Speaker, drumlins, rivers throughout this large tract of land, sea coasts, cliffs and beaches are part of this wonderful landscape, Mr. Speaker. This biosphere reserve features diverse and unique plant and animal species, Mr. Speaker. It's just an incredible tract of land, and countless generations of Mi'kmaq lived off of that land for generations, Mr. Speaker. Those lands have seen in past generations the settling of Acadians and loyalists to those lands, Mr. Speaker, and those settlers farmed and fished those lands, Mr. Speaker. And when you think of those generations living off of that land, that indeed is a green economy. It's incredible to walk on some of those lands and understand some of the cultural and rich heritage of that landscape. And Mr. Speaker, today, the residents who live around that biosphere certainly understands the significance of that protection and what it means today in terms of our local economy. And what I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, is when when Queens County was given the news that Bowater Mersey would be closed, the community immediately picked themselves up by their bootstraps, Mr. Speaker, and started talking about our economic destiny and what it would look like in the future without a pulp and paper mill in the economic mix. And Mr. Speaker, some of the presentations that I have been at focused on our rich natural landscape, and part of that rich natural landscape includes this beautiful tract of land that is protected and designated as the Southwest Nova Biosphere, Mr. Speaker. And some of those presenters started talking about how can we highlight the fact that this beautiful tract of land is protected, but how can we also look at what potential economic benefits it can have for us in Queens County and beyond. And some of the suggestions that have been put forward, and I know some people are right now as we speak, Mr. Speaker, working on projects that can see some economic benefit from this protected land. And what community members want to do, Mr. Speaker, is we want to showcase these lands, these protected lands, to the world, Mr. Speaker. We have this designation. We want to be able to showcase these beautiful lands to people in the form of perhaps hiking trails throughout some of those lands. We want to be able to share the culture and the history of those lands. We want to be able to stand up and be proud of those lands and say, this is what we have accomplished with the partnerships that have come around the table to see that designation, Mr. Speaker. This truly is about environmental goals and sustainability, Mr. Speaker, when we see such a vast tract of land that can have potential economic value, Mr. Speaker. There are many people that are working to make that happen, Mr. Speaker. The Southwest Nova Biosphere hosts a volunteer board of directors, which includes many advisors from 5 municipalities, Mr. Speaker. There is representation from Annapolis, there's representation from Digby, Yarmouth, Shelburne, and Queens, Mr. Speaker. There are also members from the First Nations community, Mr. Speaker. There are community members that have volunteered as part of the board of directors with the biosphere. Our regional development authorities have also come to the table around the biosphere. Local industry has expressed interest in the biosphere and wanting to be an advisor to the biosphere. Many NGOs are also around the table. We have organizations who are well versed in the culture and heritage of the area, and we have many educational organizations who also are partners to the biosphere. And of course, we have other provincial and federal government partners as well. We have the Department of Environment, both provincially and federally, the Department of Natural Resources, and Parks Canada is also an influential partner with the biosphere. And these partners are gathered around the table looking at how best we can showcase this tract of land to the world, Mr. Speaker, and how we can gain some economic benefit while at the same time protecting this pristine wilderness, Mr. Speaker. I guess in conclusion, what I want to say, I want to come back to more of the specifics of the bill and the fact that our government has certainly taken a leadership role. We haven't forgotten the vision of this bill. We haven't forgotten the importance of partnering our environment with the economy. We certainly understand that it is now in 2012 where the green economy is no longer considered a catchphrase, Mr. Speaker. The green economy is an economy that will grow, will expand, it will be accepted. Most will agree that we need to have strong leadership to have the full benefit of a green economy, and we're doing just that. We've taken on that leadership role, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the opposition members who feel we need to take it a little bit slowly in terms of our renewable energy project. We need to kind of slow the wheels down a little bit. So basically what I hear the opposition members saying is they really don't see that there is a need to grow the economy while at the same time looking at preserving the environment. And I need to scratch my head at that because I'm a grandmom, Mr. Speaker, and to me it's very important that we continue on the path that we are on, this government is on, and that we recognize the importance of preserving and sustaining our natural environment, because when my granddaughter, Ruby, yes, her name is Ruby, and she is 3 years old, Mr. Speaker, and she's cute as a button, Mr. Speaker, and she's the delight of my heart. And I can tell you, when she reaches my age, I want her to be able to look back and say, my Grammy, Mr. Speaker, was part of a government way back when that really did care about the environment and really understood that we could not only protect and preserve and sustain an environment, but she can say we also seen economic opportunity at the same time, Mr. Speaker. Most of us who are parents, some of us are grandparents, like myself, Mr. Speaker. Some of us may not be parents, but all of us have some connection to young people, Mr. Speaker, and most of us, I think, can say we know a young child that is growing up in today's crazy world with its changing climates and uncertainty in terms of energy security, and in some places of the world, water security, Mr. Speaker. And so I'm pleased to stand here and say that we are concerned about those very things for future generations, Mr. Speaker. We indeed want to see a better future for our children and grandchildren and all of the children that we know, Mr. Speaker, in our lives. And this government recognizes that it is not easy, some of the decisions we're making, but they need to be made, Mr. Speaker, and we are making them. And I am soon going to take my place, Mr. Speaker, because I think I've filled my time, unless you want me to continue, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I will take my feet. I'll take my feet. I'll take my seat, Mr. Speaker. I will take my seat, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to this moving forward. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to make a few remarks about the Green Economy Act. Now, while most of the amendments where they're striking out words like environmental in Nova Scotia are fairly innocuous, we find it odd that the NDP government would choose to remove these sorts of words when the Act is supposed to be about Nova Scotia's environment. And you have to ask yourself, why are these changes being made in the first place? It seems like it might be busy work for the government to do this, but then again, most of the government's work on the environment over the past 3.5 years has been just that. And you know, a lot of days when I come into work, I come across the McKay Bridge, and there's a sign along my route, and it talks about the NDP clear cutting. And it actually turns out to be a law student who was so frustrated, who so thought that the NDP would deal with this issue, that he's actually taken what little money he has to take out billboards and put them up. And I think a number of members in this House received a letter the other day outlining that, showing some pictures of the clear cutting. And I know we were just discussing here in our caucus how surprisingly, how shocking those photographs in fact are. So this person who believed that the NDP would in fact deal with the clear-cutting issue has been so upset that he's actually taken to putting up billboards to try and shame this government into doing something. And you have to ask yourself, if this government is concerned about the environment, why did they relax mercury emission targets instead of forcing Nova Scotia Power to do what they were supposed to do? Get their facilities up to snuff. And I remember the former Minister of Energy commenting on that change, which is, anyway, saying it would be cheaper for Nova Scotians, even though it put public health at risk and endangered our environment. In fact, it wasn't cheaper. We recently found out that Liberty's audit of the FAM resulted in an extra $3.6 million being spent by NSP because of the matter. And the minister boasts about 14 of the 21 aspects having been achieved, but it's good, but a lot of them were late. And some, like the wetland strategy and the water strategy, lacked any true detail, any true substance, which brings us to another point on this bill, a point that was raised when it first came into the House 5 years ago, and that's that there's no enforcement provisions attached to this bill. So when Nova Scotia Power decides not to meet another target, there's no repercussions. There's no stick. And you have to ask yourself, where are the teeth to make sure companies and all people meet the goals laid out in the Act? There's nothing there, and that's not a new thing with this government, particularly with Nova Scotia Power, and they've been the chief apologists for Nova Scotia Power. They relaxed mercury targets when NSP should have met them in 2010. Every other province signed on to this agreement, but somehow Nova Scotia couldn't meet or exceed our targets. Every other province did it. And it's a common aspect of life under the NDP that that's exactly what happens. It's not to say we don't support these amendments, but they lack substance for the most part. You know, I think the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville was talking about the new high school that's going in my riding. And I was through there for a tour, I think it was early October when I got to go for a tour, and it was great to see the steps they're taking to make that a green building. They're going to use natural gas, and it was quite a different physical plant than you would normally see in a building that didn't have that kind of fuel. So they will be able to heat and cool with natural gas. And the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville made a claim that I was taking credit for the school in my newsletter. So I just actually happen to have the newsletter here. And it says New Bedford High School update. On October 2nd, I was pleased to lace up some steel-toed boots for a tour of the new Community Centre High School on Innovation Drive. Each day, about 150 workers are on site building our new facility. They have lost very few days to weather so far. Wow, taking a lot of claim there. And then I would go on. PCL Construction Superintendent Sharif Hashem took Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal Chief Architect Terry Smith-Lamoth and me around the school, showing us places like this soon-to-be green roof, the outdoor band shell, casual student workspaces, and classrooms that overlook the basin. I came away from the tour very excited about the high school our students will soon experience. The replacement school for Charles P. Allen High School is on time and on budget and is expected to open in September 2013. HRSB requested a school built for 1,200 students, and that is what is being built. While this new school can accommodate up to 1,400 students, I remain concerned our new school will be quickly overcrowded unless another new high school is soon built. None has been approved by the Department of Education at this time. HRM is building a community center and gym attached to the school and has upgraded the field with AstroTurf and lights. Bleachers and the scoreboard have yet to come, but it's pretty exciting to see that field ready and waiting, and I have a couple of pictures of the facility there. So I'm not sure how the member for Hammonds Plains got so confused. He may have actually confused that with the issue of the field storage, which I have mentioned previously in this House, and which I will take some small credit for keeping the government's feet to the fire, but certainly I have never claimed credit for that high school, even though the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville may have thought so, but I did send my newsletter to the Speaker's office before I sent it out, so I could not have claimed credit for the high school because that would have been inappropriate. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to table my newsletter, and with those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat.
The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to stand today and talk to this bill, Bill 136, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. Mr. Speaker, I would like to introduce a word that's not often used in this legislature, and I will spell it after I attempt to say it. It's netukulimp. Netukulimp, spelled N-E-T-U-K-U-L-I-M-K. And Mr. Speaker, it's a Mi'kmaq concept, and what it means is achieving adequate standards of community and economic well-being without jeopardizing the integrity and diversity or productivity of our environment. And Mr. Speaker, Bill 136, the Green Economy Act, strives to do just that. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians care about their environment and are world leaders in recycling and waste management. And in my area, the Why Not Settlement Recycling Facility led the way for communities across the province. When my children were young, this facility was one of the first in Nova Scotia and made trips all over the world showing all the different procedures that they were doing. And my children learned all the recycling principles. They toured the facility and then came home and taught their mums and dads exactly what recycling was all about. And it's usually a very good way to teach grown-ups is by teaching the kids, and then they shame their grown-up parents into learning how to do all those things. The awareness around recycling in our area is really huge. And when my daughter Claire moved to Toronto, she was really shocked to see the number of people who did not recycle properly, and was very proud of coming from an area, small rural Nova Scotia, that was really leading the world and certainly leading her friends. And she, in fact, has shamed all of them into learning how to recycle properly as well. Mr. Speaker, the government knows that protecting the environment is about real changes that we make in our daily lives, such as recycling. And our government has shown leadership in this area in achieving many goals. And Mr. Speaker, as the member for Queens and the members for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville have already noted, our government has achieved quite a number of goals, some worthy of mention again. The natural resource strategy, which is something that's very important in our area. Many of my constituents were very involved in that, and actually in the Colin Stewart Forest Forum, one of my dear friends, Paul Pross, was certainly a contributor to that document. The wetland conservation policy is something that's also very important, and it plays out in different ways. In my area, there's a cranberry farm called Terra Beata, and when you're starting to develop any sort of cranberry bog, if you're going to use land, then you need to create another bog in another place. And as a result of meeting with the people there, and Mr. Ernst and his wife were very ingenious people and have worked very hard to make their business a success, explained a lot about this act that really helped me understand how it works in practical terms. Some of the other things that we've already achieved are sewage treatment facilities meeting guidelines. In Mahone Bay, this is really quite significant. When you drive into my town, there's a little sign that says, "We love the beauty around us and we welcome you to share it." The good thing was that a number of years ago, you didn't say we welcome you to share the beauty and not the water, because our little bay had raw sewage going into the bay. And our town of less than 900 people worked very hard to get a sewage treatment plant together. We realized that through public consultation, a lot of people in the town weren't for that. It meant raising taxes to deal with it, but we went ahead, bit the bullet, and was one of the first small towns in our area to do such a thing. So now when we say we welcome you to share the beauty around us, we also welcome you to share the water in Mahone Bay. Some of the other achievements that our government has already, goals that our government has already achieved, we have met the worldwide standard for airborne fine particulate matter. Canadian-wide standard for ground-level ozone constituency has been met. Building Code Act, which includes energy efficiency for homes. In my area, there's one of the first green communities in Nova Scotia called Hawthorne Hill. And it is a hill, and there were many, many hawthorn trees on that hill, hence the name. And yet, there's still lots of hawthorn trees there. But the development has gone into stage 2, which is building a new road, and all the houses that are there are environmentally using environmental guidelines, and people have come from all over the country to build their homes in this area and to live in the area. And we're very proud that our constituent Ian Startup, who started the project, is already in the successful stage 2 of that project. Mr. Speaker, as part of the EGSPA legislation requirements, a public review is needed every 5 years by a round table. Mr. Speaker, the round table is a voluntary board consisting of members from legal, academic, industrial, and environmental sectors who advise the Minister of Environment on environmental and sustainability issues. These people, when you look at the caliber and quality and breadth of this group, this round table, you can certainly understand that the kind of information that they will be bringing and sifting through would be of a very high caliber indeed. The public engagement is a very important part and key part of the EGSPA review. Mr. Speaker, over 70 participants attended the 5 public meetings that were held across the province, and there was great participation on the South Shore area. Over 80 written submissions were also received, and from all this, the roundtable were able to compile this information. The feedback that was provided by environmental groups, industry associations, municipalities, and members of the public all contributed to this report. Mi'kmaq organizations, both on and off reserve peoples, also provided input.